Hello, so welcome to the 17th session of the Mulumatamuga Category Reading Group. Today we're reading chapter 24, an analysis of the Noble Truths. So as usual, I'll read from the commentary. The subject of this chapter is the Buddhist teaching known as the Four Noble Truths. In the first 6 verses, the opponent objects that if, as Nāgārjuna claims, all is indeed empty, then this teaching, as well as all that follows from it, is put in jeopardy. In replying, Nāgārjuna first claims that the opponent has misunderstood the purport of the doctrine of emptiness. He then seeks to turn the tables on the opponent and show that what would actually jeopardize the Buddhist teachings is denying emptiness, or affirming that there are things with intrinsic nature. And so Sagar and I were just talking about how no matter how diverse the Buddhist teachings are, in many ways they're just elaborations on the more fundamental teaching on suffering, which is encapsulated in the Four Noble Truths. So it makes sense why when interrogating the view that emptiness undermines the Buddhist teachings, we can focus on the Four Noble Truths as a sort of exemplary teaching that could pose as the best example of whether or not emptiness allows it to actually work, this teaching to be effective, or if it actually undermines it. And so, of course, what we just read with the commentary, this whole chapter basically is a defense of the idea that emptiness, when properly understood, doesn't just keep the Buddha's teachings and mundane convention intact, but actually is what makes it possible in the first place. And so we'll go into this. And just at the outset, something I want to mention is one of the interesting things about this chapter in particular is that, so there's a certain kind of pattern that shows up in some parts of the text previously, which is that the opponent, the hypothetical interlocutor who is functioning as an opponent, will say something as a rebuttal or an objection. And Nāgārjuna or the Madhyamaka's response would be something very similar, if not identical, to the very same objection, with a slightly different meaning, to show how the issue is not with the Madhyamaka, but the way that the interlocutor is interpreting the doctrine of emptiness. And so you get a lot of this in this chapter, where basically the opponent will say, because if things are empty, then this can't happen. So that's why you're wrong. And the Madhyamaka will respond, well, if things were not empty, what you said would not happen. And so that's why things are not empty. And I just like this interesting pattern. It's very much makes me think of the Zizek meme about like the sort of stereotype about dialectics. It's like, but what if the exact opposite were the case? Like it's the kind of pattern that I'm seeing here. It's like the interlocutor will say one thing, this is why emptiness is not true because X, Y, Z. And then Nāgārjuna is like, well, what if it's the exact opposite? It's actually because you think it's not empty that X, Y, Z is not possible. So, but now we'll go a little bit more concrete with examples of this by going right into the verses. So I'll actually read 1 through 6 straight, and then we can actually go a little bit one by one with each verse, only because the first 6 verses is basically the major start of the opponent's objection to the view of emptiness, or to the thesis of emptiness, or the doctrine of emptiness. Verse 1, objection. If all this is empty, there is neither origination nor cessation. It follows for you that there is the non-existence of the Four Noble Truths. Verse 2. Comprehension, abandonment, practice, and personal realization, none of these is possible due to the non-existence of the Four Noble Truths. Verse 3, and due to the non-existence of those, the Four Noble Fruits of the stream winner, once returner, never returner, and arhat do not exist. If the fruits are non-existent, then there are neither the strivers for nor the attainers of those fruits. Verse 4, the Sangha does not exist if the 8 kinds of persons do not exist. And because of the non-existence of the Four Noble Truths, the true Dharma does not exist either. Verse 5. Dharma and Sangha being non-existent, how will the Buddha come to be? In this way, you deny all 3 jewels when you proclaim 6. Emptiness. You deny the real existence of the karmic fruit, both good and bad actions, and all worldly modes of conduct. So basically, what we're reading here is the opponent's view that when emptiness is taken to be true, it undermines the Four Noble Truths. So let's go by verse. So in the first verse, they say that if all things are empty, there's neither origination nor cessation. And the reason why this undermines the Four Noble Truths, of course, is because if there's no origination or no cessation, then there would have been no origination of suffering and no possibility of the cessation of suffering. So that's why, according to the opponent, to think that all things are empty, it entails that the Four Noble Truths do not exist or are not actually true. 2, comprehension, abandonment, practice, and personal realization. None of these is possible due to the non-existence of the Four Noble Truths. And the commentary here makes a parallel between these 4 aspects listed in the first part of the verse: comprehension, abandonment, practice, and personal realization, as what each noble truth respectively consists in. So the first is a comprehension of the truth of suffering. 2 is the abandonment of suffering, once we understand that there is a cause of suffering. And practice, which is the practice of reaching the point in which suffering can be eliminated, in which suffering can cease. And personal realization, which is the direct experiential realization of the fruition of the Eightfold Noble Path, which is the cessation of suffering. So none of these aspects of the path can hold if the Four Noble Truths don't hold. And according to the opponent, the Four Noble Truths don't hold because of accepting emptiness. And so we don't really have to go too much into the other parts. It's basically saying the three jewels and all that's associated with it will also be denied by emptiness, according to the opponent, because that all follows from the denial of the Four Noble Truths with the acceptance of emptiness. And at the last point, at the very end of verse 6, the opponent also states that it's not just the Buddha's Dharma that gets undermined by emptiness, but all worldly modes of conduct, all mundane activities as well. And so now we're starting with the Madhyamaka or Nāgārjuna's response to these views, to these arguments. Verse 7, reply. Here we say that you do not understand the point of teaching emptiness, emptiness itself, and the meaning of emptiness. In this way, you are thus frustrated. So this basically just states out that verses 1 through 6 betrays a misunderstanding of emptiness. And so the following verses will proceed on elaborating this exact point. 8. The Dharma teaching of the Buddha rests on 2 truths, conventional truth and ultimate truth. So I think this is the first time we're explicitly, I'm not sure, actually, is this the first time we're explicitly being introduced to the 2 truths?
I think it might be, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. I think while it might be implicit in previous chapters, is directly posed here. And so just a little bit of overview on this because it's a very key topic. But here, so typically I see conventional truth as samvriti satya, but here it says, here in the verse in particular, it says loka samvriti satya, and the term loka here means people, right? So so in this case, so the conventional truth, which is the most popular English translation, is an interesting concept because it actually has multiple layered meanings. And in the commentary, we're given 3 meanings, which are given by Chandrakirti. And so I'll just actually read that out loud from the commentary. Chandrakirti gives 3 distinct etymologies for samvriti. On one etymology, the root meaning is that of concealing. So conventional truth would be all those ways of thinking and speaking that conceal the real state of affairs from ordinary people. The second explains the term to mean mutual dependency. And the third etymology, the term refers to conventions involved in customary practices of the world, the customs governing the daily conduct of ordinary people. He adds that this samvriti is of the nature of the relation between term and referent, cognition and cognized, and the like. So on this understanding, conventional truth is a set of beliefs that ordinary people use in their daily conduct, and it is conventional because of its reliance on conventions concerning semantic and cognitive relations. And in particular in this verse, because it says, in particular, loka samvriti satya, well, we can say that here, the idea of customary practices of ordinary people, this sort of meaning of the term is giving slight precedence here. I do want to mention that another interesting translation I've seen is transactional. This actually might be more direct translation of another term that often is associated with conventional truth, which is not samvriti satya, but I think it starts with like a V. Do you know what I'm talking about, Sagar? I think it might be literally what transactional truth is translating from.
Do you mean vyavahara?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. What do you know that to mean?
Vyavahara is what they here translate as like customary modes of talking. Literally, it just means like behavior.
Oh.
So, but like custom, established practice, that's what vyavahara is.
I see. So very much related. I've seen it in context popping up.
Actually, but actually vyavahara can also mean a transaction or a deal.
Nice.
Yes, vyavahara can mean trade, transaction, deal, or a loan even, I think, can be vyavahara. But yes, but it also means like, it's a term that appears a lot in like judicial contexts, like a trial or investigation of a case or a lawsuit is also called vyavahara.
Interesting. Can you spell that out in English just so I can write it down real quick, so I can look at it later? Oh, I see. Thank you. Yeah, actually, that one in particular is actually very interesting to me with my own project of trying to make this connection between the Marxist understanding of abstractions as they get materialized in capitalism on the basis of exchange, and the idea that conventional truth has this possible relationship with the exchange of things is a really interesting thing to me, because and hopefully it's not too much of a tangent. I think this will elucidate something about conventional truth, which is that in the exchange relation, in commodity production and circulation, what you're basically having is two different things which are actually not reducible to each other in any way, right? So like a pan, like a metal pan, and like a piece of paper, right? There's really no true equivalence between them, other than the fact that they're both empty, perhaps. But the idea that there might be something between them, a common property, a common substance that they share in order for them to be exchanged with each other, that's an abstraction that's happening. But what's interesting is that this is not necessarily an abstraction that happens in the mind, but it's a real abstraction in the sense that it's an abstraction that happens in the physical act of exchange. And so what's happening is not real in the sense that there's no actual common substance between the two items being exchanged, but the social practice that assumes that there is a kind of universal equivalent that each of them can be equivocated with each other, which is money. Money is just an abstract unit that commodities are equivocated against in order to be exchanged within one another. So it's unreal because what is being exchanged is not actually in the commodities being exchanged, but it's real in the sense that it's an abstraction instantiated through practice between beings. And I think this is very much what conventional truth or conventional reality functions as.
So
It's
there's an article I really think that you should read. I think you would really like it. Have you looked at any of the things in Moon Shadows? You know, the Cowherds volume.
yeah, I haven't read the whole thing, but I have read some essays.
So okay, so I really think you should read the Moon Shadows essay called The Merely Conventional Existence of the World.
Okay, is that Westerhoff? That sounds like a Westerhoff.
Yeah, it is Westerhoff. And basically what it does is it takes David Lewis's account of how through linguistic transactions you could create emergently linguistic signs by convention, and then argues that you can expand this for not just signs and names for objects, but for the objects themselves. And that similar kinds of transactions, as David Lewis describes, creating linguistic conventions, could be imagined, especially if brought to the level of like all interactions between beings and not just communicative interactions, to render all objects existent by convention. That is, by the conventions established by the beings. It's a really good essay.
I know. Thank you for that. I think it's definitely very relevant. Because it is that connection I'm trying to make between, because there's one simple way you can understand conventional truth and imputation as a kind of like mental projection. But what if there's an unreality to the objects, but they're still really concrete, right? They're actually part of material practice. So that's like really interesting essay. It sounds like will help me. But what was I saying? But yeah, I think that's actually most of it for conventional truth. And so the second truth, Paramata Satya, is roughly translated as ultimate truth or reality. And so I've never really seen many different translations other than ultimate, but I have seen the translation absolute. And I tend to have qualms with that. And I think typically what you see instead of conventional versus ultimate, sometimes you see absolute and relative. This might just be my limited perspective, but I've noticed mostly like Zen teachers use sort of absolute and relative. That just might be a coincidence, and they're definitely talking about the two truths. But it's only in sort of Indo-Tibetan, when teachers are working from the Indo-Tibetan tradition, they're much more consistent with like conventional and ultimate. And for me, I think it's important to make this distinction between ultimate and absolute, because for me, ultimate, especially when you think in terms of ultimate analysis, what you're trying to investigate is the final mode of being. Of something, the mode of being that something finally reduces to, or any aspects of itself is grounded upon.
When you've removed all things that one could claim are just merely imputations that we're putting onto it.
Right.
And I love the phrase of "from its own side." I'm not actually sure if this exists in Sanskrit is the thing. The like from its own side talk. I know that there's a Sanskrit word which is like by its own, like established by its own nature, svalakshana siddhi, established through its own nature. But I love the phrase established from its own side that's used in Tibetan. I think that is very illustrative for like what the ultimate nature of a thing would be. It would be what it has from its side that you didn't give it.
Right. It's basically what you get when all the adventitious aspects of it are removed, all the contingencies. What is the necessary foundation of it being when all of its contingent aspects are removed? And so because there's this, I guess you can say, in the whether it's instantaneous or gradual, there is a movement of negation, right, of removal to find that ultimate nature. So there's this, so that's why I associate ultimate with finality. It's that final mode of being once all the adventitious elements are removed. Whereas absolute is more so, I think, attributing qualities to something that you would have already assumed to find. And I think actually our connotations with what we mean by absolute, especially in a context like absolute reality or absolute truth, I think that very much describes svabhava, what we think of its own being, independently existing, unchanging, unrelated. So just a slight qualm I have with when I see people.
Interesting is
Mhm.
in the Nāgārjuna's Madhyamaka philosophical introduction, Vestroff's intro to Nāgārjuna, he uses the word absolute, though not with respect to truth. He still calls it ultimate truth. What he calls absolute is he calls emptiness the absolute svabhava.
Interesting.
Because he notes that one of the ways svabhava is used is in the sense of what a thing would have if it were ultimately real. And that's the kind that's being rejected. But there's another way svabhava is used, which is to just refer to emptiness and things' nature of being empty. And that is what he calls their absolute svabhava. Because following even like in this chapter where Nāgārjuna says like everything only makes sense if everything is empty, the precondition for things, even conventional existence, is their emptiness. So it's in a way, even though it's not actually their svabhava, because its emptiness is empty, right? And its emptiness, as is said in this very chapter again, many times, which I think we're about to get to, is not being proposed here as some kind of thing, as though it's not also a conceptual, a merely useful conceptual thing. In a sense, it is their most important svabhava. And that's one of the ways that Chandrakirti uses the word svabhava. So Vestroff,
I've noticed that.
like that's their absolute svabhava. And the other kind of svabhava he calls their substance svabhava. And that's the one that's rejected.
I see. Interesting.
I like that. I thought it was a useful way of splitting. And I think absolute kind of makes sense there in a way.
Yeah, I'm definitely thinking through these two different uses of the term, and I guess like my qualm, which may not actually be a true qualm if I understand Westerhoff more, but I guess it's like, okay, I can understand emptiness being the absolute svabhava, or almost sort of the absolute nature of something, in the sense that for emptiness to be true, it would have to always be there at all the time. So it's like emptiness would have to be nothing that's exceptional. So no matter what, every time you look to analyze a conventional entity, you will have to find emptiness. So in that sense, emptiness is absolute. But at the same time, I always wonder, it's like, well, doesn't the emptiness of emptiness undermine even emptiness being an absolute, right? So if anything, emptiness as an absolute or a svabhava is at the very least a kind of maybe important and necessary on a conventional level to have that concept, but at the level of realization or just direct recognition of emptiness, there's nothing even there to be understood as absolute or not. So in some of my own writing that's not explicitly naming Buddhism, but inspired by it too, I've also thought about using the term absolute immanence, but like absolute in quotations, as a way to like qualify it. But I don't know. Anyway, let's see. Yes, and just to finish off this verse, I'll actually read something interesting in the commentary on this verse about the two truths. The Akuttabhaya explained that the ultimate truth is the faultless realization of the noble ones, the Aryas, namely that no dharmas whatsoever arise. There are two ways that this may be understood. The first is that according to Madhyamaka, ultimate reality does not contain anything that arises. And since Buddhists generally agree that there are no eternal entities, this would mean that ultimate reality contains no entities whatsoever. The realization of emptiness would then be insight into the true character of reality, that is utterly devoid of existing entities. According to the second possible interpretation, the ultimate truth according to Madhyamaka is just that there is no such thing as the way that reality ultimately is. Or to put this in a somewhat paradoxical way, the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth. On this reading, what the Aryas realize is that the very idea of how things really are, independently of our useful semantic and cognitive conventions, is incoherent. So I really like this interesting idea of these two different ways of understanding. And I like that the commentary doesn't even give you which like a preference for one, and so it's almost up to you to get to the sense of, is the first one true? Is the second one true? Are they both true? Or neither of them true? And what I've noticed is the idea. So if we can like break this down really simply, one possible way of understanding the ultimate is that the ultimate reality is devoid of anything. And the second is that the very concept of ultimate reality is incoherent. And I see that there's actually, they're sort of, they sort of tend towards either experience or reason. So the idea that ultimate reality is devoid of anything, that's an experiential sort of understanding, recognition. At first I wrote down phenomenological, but then I realized there's no phenomena. So if anything, maybe experiential would be a better term here. And the idea that ultimate reality is an incoherent concept, that's a logical idea. So in a sense, these two views actually don't, these two interpretations actually don't really contradict at all. So they're just,
I agree, yeah,
different ways of approaching basically the same fundamental view, and which is that it's because ultimate reality is incoherent that there's nothing to be found in ultimate reality.
right.
Let's see. So maybe this is also to go too much of on a tangent on this particular verse, but and if anyone listening is part of the Facebook group, you can search these terms and there might be a discussion that comes up. But the idea that the ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth. That's a very popular description of the ultimate truth. I think very much, popularized or even put forth by Sideritz, actually, who is one of the authors, but also supported by Garfield. And it's a very contentious idea. And there's a couple of articles, there's some literature out there that doesn't accept this view. And especially especially because it's a very rationalistic view of ultimate, which is probably kind of Gelug inspired. Whereas a more subtle alternative might be that there is an ultimate truth, but that's what is experienced directly. But again, maybe it's just one of these cases where the two views put forth are actually not really contradictory at all.
There's an interesting, with respect to them not being contradictory, there's it's on podcast, there's a podcast version of it. It's the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies talk by, it's a very interesting talk. It's a talk by Jan Westerhoff called "What Kind of Philosophical Theory is Madhyamaka?" And he proposes that there are a couple of options. One option being, he ends up basically taking this like Gendon Chopel inspired view as his position. But basically he's like, so there's one theory, which is that Madhyamaka is an account of the ultimate nature of things as being like dependently originated. And so this is like Indra's net type thing. And there's another account, which is like the ultimate nature, the ultimate reality is that there is no ultimate reality, where the first ultimate reality means the truth you have to realize, and the second ultimate reality means a fundamental way that things are. So like, in other words, the first way of using ultimate reality, and that's like the Sideritz-y kind of thing. And
I think he calls it the semantic interpretation.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a sort of another view, which is that, and anyway, what his point in the end is that actually all of these different views are useful, and that the Madhyamaka shouldn't take a strong position on what kind of theory Madhyamaka is, because Madhyamaka is supposed to be targeting the problems of the specific person who is having their views deconstructed.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
for some people, that's going to require the semantic dimension, wherein you pull apart a notion of an ultimate description of the world, right?
Right.
And for other people, it's going to require the like Indra's net type thing, where you refute that there are sort of self-standing like things that are independently there, not dependent on others.
Mhm.
And for other people, you're going to need the more like the Gendon Chopel style stuff is just totally illusory kind of thing. For people who are attached to what he says like naturalists, basically, like the sort of standard contemporary metaphysical position of naturalism needs Gendon Chopel's cups and vases and mountains are just illusions
Mhm.
level of that thing. But you shouldn't pick one as like the real way Madhyamaka is. All of these dimensions are useful in particular contexts, is what his take.
I like that. I like that a lot, definitely. And you just mentioning that has just like made me take a deep breath, and I'm like, all right, yeah, these two both things are equally valid, and let's move on. And it's very characteristic, I've noticed, at Westerhoff, which is this idea of like a kind of tactical opposition. It's like, and I can already see in these two interpretations, Indra's net versus ultimate versus semantic interpretation, ultimate truth and not ultimate truth. The ultimate truth is that there is no ultimate truth. There's almost like a reflection of the two extremes there. Indra's net could maybe be characterized as a kind of, or at least tending towards the extreme of eternalism, in the sense that there are there's all of these interconnected things that are all mutually dependent, and in a way sort of keep each other intact all the time as this like total nexus of cosmic relations. Or on the other hand, you have this like absolute elimination of any concept of truth. And instead of being like, oh, which one do I use? It's like, depending, it's like if you meet a nihilist, you throw out Indra's net at them. And if you meet an absolutist, you throw them, the nihilistic seeming no truth, ultimate truth is no truth kind of thing. And in the process, hopefully you get them to somewhere closer to the middle, in a way. And this is still a tactic that I'm very interested in, and I need to read more Westerhoff, honestly. But
it also seems to kind of influence the way he structures his own argumentative philosophical work. Like the non-existence of the real world has the following chapter structure. Chapter 1, the non-existence of the external world. Chapter 2, the non-existence of the internal world. Chapter 3, the non-existence of foundational objects. Chapter 4, the non-existence of foundational truths. So it's like, the way he envisions it is, you start off as a common sense realist, and then we get rid of your commitment to things that are mind independent. And then we get rid of your commitment to things that are really of the nature of being mind. And then we get rid of your commitment to things that, whatever they are of the nature of being, are holding up the whole structure. And then we get rid of your commitment to the idea that a foundationless structure is a ultimate description of how things are. And then he says, but then you might go and wonder, well, then why did we just try and establish this description of a foundationless structure where each thing, because it can be entirely reduced to the thing, like the level of the structure below it, is an illusion. And he gives this very weird analogy where he's like, imagine you go to the theater, and behind the set, you see there's like a really beautiful like set, basically. Or like in the theater, and you're like, wow, that's really beautiful. And then you learn that the like set that you were looking at was actually just a painting the whole time. Like there was no actual set there.
Some kind of trompe-l'oeil set.
Yes. Is that what it's called?
When you paint something to look three-dimensional from a particular perspective.
Okay, yes. So yes, like that. And then you then realize, however, that you're sitting in a fake theater as well. because so what actually happens is the curtain isn't even brought up yet. So you look and there's visible on the stage is this like seeming like thing, and you're admiring this, and your friend tells you it's actually a painting. And so then you think, oh, wow, that's interesting. So it's just a screen with the painting on it, and behind it is the actual stage. I'm not looking at the stage. And then you might wonder, well, is there something behind the screen? Maybe behind the screen actually is just an actual set, exactly like what's painted on the screen. But then you find out you're sitting in a fake theater as well, and that actually there is nothing behind the screen. There is no stage behind the screen. It's just the wall. Actually, the stage was never built. You're just sitting in an auditorium. So learning that there was no stage doesn't put you back in the position you were in when you were first in the theater, when you thought that there was a stage with a three-dimensional thing set up on the stage. You realize that there's no three-dimensional thing set up on the stage, and also you realize that there's no stage for there to have ever been a three-dimensional thing set up on. But that's not the same thing as just having been in your original position.
Right, even though everything seems like nothing happened.
Yes, in reality, something did happen, and that's what the justification is for why he takes you through this thing, only to end at the semantic thing anyway.
Nice. I really need to read Non-Existence of the Real World. I think
pretty good. It's a good book.
Yeah. Well.
Okay. Well, in any case, we should get back to the text.
Yeah.
Actually, the rest of the verses can be chunked very easily because they basically follow the argument. They either follow the argument, change is not possible, or things arising in independence on conditions is not possible if things are not empty, and all of the aspects of the Four Noble Truths and the four kinds of strivers and the four kinds of attainments and the three jewels require either change occurring or things happening in dependence on conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Especially when we get to from 21 onward is basically all of that. And before that, there's a few famous verses that we can touch on before we close off. And again, I want to repeat something I mentioned at the beginning, is that very much like once you get to like halfway into the chapter, it starts to just mirror like the rest. It basically repeats the same things with maybe one or two words slightly different, which is basically like, you thought that I undermined this because in my view, actually your mistaken view is what actually undermines it. What again, like what if the opposite were true kind of move. It's actually funny, like it's like whenever sometimes I'm writing stuff on like groups or forums or something, or Facebook, based in like Madhyamaka thinking, even without naming it, and people will make like a joke about dialectics or something, and it's like I didn't even mention that, but I guess Madhyamaka is very like very by nature dialectical, especially when you think about this wrestling with opposing extremes and being able to understand how they relate to each other and how to avoid being caught up in their logic. So let's see. Okay, so that was the two truths that we went over. And then there's also, of course, a lot more, but that's not directly relevant. And just as stated, the idea that the two truths are actually one truth. And that's a whole nother topic. But verse 9. Who do not know the distinction between the two truths, they do not understand reality in accordance with the profound teachings of the Buddha. Let's see. So we can keep going. So basically states simply, the two truths are a very important device, a hermeneutic device, not just to understand the Buddhist teachings, but also to interpret the whole corpus of Buddhist teachings. Because often you will find that different suttas will say something that at face value seems to say something in direct contrast to other ones. And the most basic example is like when I think of like some of the really nice heartfelt advice to yourself and just yourself as a person in the Dhammapada, and then you have the Prajnaparamitas, like complete absolute negation of all things. And the only way you can understand the coherence of these two things and understand that neither of them are necessarily even lying is to understand how they relate to the two truth scheme. 10. The ultimate truth is not taught independently of customary ways of talking and thinking. Not having acquired the ultimate truth, nirvana is not attained. For a second, I forgot which verse this was, because honestly, this translation might be more accurate, maybe, but it's a little clunky. I want to really quickly read Garfield's translation because it's a lot more nice and epic sounding. 10. Without a foundation in the conventional truth, the significance of the ultimate cannot be taught. Without understanding the significance of the ultimate, liberation is not achieved. And so there's been lots of articles about this particular verse and how it relates to Wittgenstein. So the Wittgenstein and the Tractatus basically goes over this whole scheme of how we sort of construct the world as a system of like images and pictures in our head. I might be butchering this, it's been a while since I read it, but he sort of goes through a whole logical scheme of how we sort of understand reality, how we represent it, and how we can make sense of it. But at the end, at the very end, there's a sort of famous quote about how he's gotten you step by step through a process of understanding in a manner in which you're progressing up a ladder to go over this wall, but at the very top, you can't stay at the ladder anymore. You actually have to get off in order to, fulfill the function that the ladder is serving. And similar here, what the point is being made is that independent of the conventional truth as a ladder or a gateway or a bridge to the ultimate truth, there's no way for you to access the ultimate truth. At the very least, because we're already, as deluded beings, completely immersed in the conventional truth, not even realizing that it is the conventional truth. And this is something important to, I think, recognize too, is that in a way, the two truths is the bodhisattva's understanding in a way, because deluded being, and bodhisattvas could also be in this case, us on the bodhisattva path. But when we're not technically on the path, when we're outside of meditative equipoise, which is fairly speaking right now and most of my life, is we don't actually see conventional truth as conventional truth. Not to mix systems together, which is always bad, but I like the Yogacara view of the three natures, where it's like we don't see the dependent nature, we always see the imputed nature. So we don't really see conventional truth. And so, but this is also ironically exactly why we need the conventional truth, because we're stuck in it. So because we're stuck in it, we can't just immediately go to the ultimate. We'll just have a conceptual, conventional idea of the ultimate. So in a way, we have to work from where we are in order to gradually progress to what is the actual truth, and which in a way reflects also the Buddha's preferred pedagogical method, which is actually to work on where you are, rather than like standing up from like ultimate truth, talking to you down from conventional truth, like, why don't you come up here? It's like he comes up, meets you to where you are, so that you can actually work from there to ultimate. Yeah, I think that basically covers that concept. Actually, in page 274, they do mention Vyavahara, the customary ways of talking and thinking. So that's another thing that typically comes as conventional truth. And here's just a nice little analogy Chandrakirti uses. Verse 10ab asserts that ultimate truth cannot be taught without reliance on conventional truth. Chandrakirti likens conventional truth to the cup that the thirsty person must use in order to satisfy a need for water. So obviously you need a container for water. And yeah, but you don't eat the container. You eat the water that's that's being held by the container, and you also need the container to hold the water. Yes, here's another important point. Ultimate truth cannot be realized without first having mastered the conventional truth that the person is a fiction constructed on the basis of skandhas and so on in relations of dependent origination. And so I think this directly relates to what I had just said about how, because we're caught up in the conventional truth in such a way that we don't even know it's conventional truth, we have to first recognize that we are in conventional truth, and then using that means to go to the ultimate truth. So it's like, you know how like the fish doesn't know there's in water, like we have to recognize that we're in water first, before we get up, but we're not. But the analogy breaks down because fish need to stay in water. And another interesting point that I like here too, at the very end of that commentary of this verse, what Abhidharma takes to be the ultimate truth turns out, on the Madhyamaka understanding, to be merely conventionally true. And this is really cool pattern that I noticed in most schemes of tenet systems, of the progressive developments of tenet systems, is that each succeeding tenet system will include all of the previous tenet systems' ultimate truth as its own conventional truth. And so it's this constant process of subsumption of ultimate truths from preceding lower systems being included as a mere convention, and then a new ultimate will be proposed, until at the very end you get to Madhyamaka and no ultimate is proposed. Every other ultimate proposed is seen as conventional.
This is very characteristic of the text Madhyamaka Lankara. I don't know if you read it's a Shantarakshita text on Madhyamaka, because in it basically he just uses the neither one nor many argument over and over again to do exactly what you're saying. So he starts out with like a sort of like Sautrantika-esque view, and then he uses neither one nor many to refute external objects, I think. And then he's like, okay, so now we're on a view where we're kind of like brought everything to mind. And then he's like, okay, we can use the neither one nor many argument again on like merely mental appearances. And then he's like, okay, now we're on a Madhyamaka level. And then then the rest of it is like spelling out the two truths, basically. But basically the text's purpose is to do exactly what you're saying. It's a very interesting, it's also very beautiful. The verses, it's in verse, and then there's a prose commentary by Kamalashila that I don't know if it's been translated. The commentary that I've seen with is Mipam's commentary, which is a Nyingma commentorial interpretation. But the verses are really beautiful. It actually ends up like forming this it's making the neither one nor many argument. So that part is maybe less beautiful because it's just like the argument again and again. But especially like the second part explaining the two truths and everything, and then how it ends. It's a very beautiful text.
No, I definitely want to look into that. I definitely want to be able to master this really beautiful thing that Buddhist commentators can do, is just seamlessly move from incredibly Baroque, like romantic, sublime language, and then immediately like insanely dry, cold, like terse, logical, like arguments and analyses, and then go straight to.
And Kamalashila are very good at that.
Oh yeah. It's like the exquisite, sublime son of a million, blah, 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 said this very, very logical point. And let me tell you, so I really want to master that. I think it's really stylistically very intriguing. And it's nice to know that that Shantarakshita and I have something very common, something in common, which is that we love the one or many argument, which is nice.
That now I remember. Actually, the first thing he does is he applies the neither one nor many argument. He first starts from a non-Buddhist position and applies the neither one nor many argument to the person. And then he goes to the Sautrantika position, and then he applies it to external objects, and then he applies it to the mind, and then he explains the two truths. So he does it actually 3 times, not 2 times.
Cool. Yeah, actually, and my own like scheming of trying to put together, but also to make my own like tenet system. It does seem always nice to start off with a non-Buddhist view, as like sort of the characteristic positive view in a way, because in a way like the common
sense view.
Right. Yeah. Cool. Okay, so that was 10. Okay, 11. Emptiness misunderstood. So this is another very famous one, and I can read Garfield's one as well. Not quite different, but emptiness misunderstood destroys the slow-witted, like a serpent wrongly held or a spell wrongly executed. And Garfield translates, by a misperception of emptiness. This is interesting. Misperception versus misunderstood. Garfield says, by a misperception of emptiness, a person of little intelligence is destroyed, like a snake incorrectly seized, or like a spell incorrectly cast. And I also, this is just funny because I mean, they're probably Buddhist too. Suitors and Katsura, I mean, depends. But so they might actually believe in the possibility of sorcery. But I like how in the commentary it almost like so the commentary says, as novice snake handlers and apprentice sorcerers can attest, serpents and magic spells are dangerous instruments in the hands of those who lack the requisite knowledge.
Yeah, Shoryo Katsura is like a proponent of attempts to reconcile Buddhism with naturalism. So I think he does not believe in magic.
Right.
And Mark Sideretz is similar with respect to this. Though actually, interestingly, Shoryo Katsura doing that is kind of in a traditional context because he is actually a Jodo Shinshu Buddhist.
Interesting.
But within Jodo Shinshu, there was like this movement.
Is that a modernist movement?
No, so Jodo Shinshu is not a modernist sect. It's just that there has been a modernist movement in Jodo Shinshu to basically view, like, try and combine it with naturalism and then view the Pure Land as like metaphorical.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's
interesting.
Anyway. So I think that they're probably being a little facetious.
Right.
Or maybe not. I mean, sometimes you see people who seem to be like a lot of times like in this sort of milieu of like Buddhist naturalist types. But then like I first recently saw something. So one person who is of this sort, I thought, was Roger R. Jackson, because I knew of his basically like his famous agnosticism regarding rebirth that he says originated basically from when he decided to do his PhD thesis on Dharmakirti's arguments for rebirth and found that they weren't really all that persuasive. So he decided that he was the type who would need arguments to convince him and wasn't just going to go on trusting the Buddha, and so would be agnostic about it. But then interestingly, I found an article of his where he says, caveat though, that it would be probably problematic to just dispense with it, even if there's agnosticism that's sort of legitimate, and reduce Buddhism to an exotic kind of secular humanism. And also that we should keep in mind that it's not as if we have a disproof of rebirth, and we should, and what he finishes with is, we should modestly recall Hamlet's remark to Horatio, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. So sometimes you see people who seem like they wouldn't believe in magic say stuff like that, and then you're like, oh, I don't know, maybe. I don't know about Katsura.
Well, he has also, his agnostic position is interesting. I've always found my issue with agnosticism generally as like a disposition on a kind of a dilemma, is that they precisely seem to lack exactly what gives the two extremes their merit, but they're taken too far by the two extremes. And by what that I mean is the confidence. It's like the absolutist and the sort of materialist are very confident about their views, and the agnostic might be like, well, we can't really decide between the two.
Maybe I should clarify what his agnosticism means. He says, he describes himself as, though I am not sure about it, I live as if all of the parts of the Buddhist worldview are true, including me. That's what he says, is his agnosticism is to be not committed to it, but to live as if it is true. So he's
okay. So maybe
that's maybe a kind of agnosticism that does have some of the force, because
yeah. I mean, I'm sure it definitely works for him. I just feel like it just to push things farther, it's like maybe even it seems a little not as confident as it could be. It's like I tend to find that agnosticism in many positions, it's like they see the problem with these diametrical opposition between the two camps often that is being posed against each other. And so, but because of that, it's like a shy away from making a position. And sometimes, and this is just something I'm thinking through, is like, is it possible to still be confident about your understanding while also not choosing any of the three positions, like not even being agnostic about it? And it's like for me, like, okay, rebirth. Does it exist? Does it not exist? Or is it something that may or may not exist, or we just live by it? I guess like, for me, it's like, well, it is true, but it's not ultimately true. And isn't, and I feel like that doesn't really fit in either none of the three options. But
maybe with to give credence to your point from say scripture, for example, it's interesting that the Buddha says that right view is the forerunner of the other limbs of the Eightfold Path. And in that same sutta where he says that, he says right view is of two kinds. There's the kind of right view that noble ones have, and there's the kind of right view that can be had even by one who's not a noble one. And the kind of right view that is had by someone who's not a noble one, in other words, the kind of right view you have to start with to then get the other limbs of the path, he says, there is what is given, what is offered, what is sacrificed. There are karmic fruits and results of good and bad actions. There is this world and the next world, i.e. an afterlife. There is mother and father. There are spontaneously reborn beings, as in like beings that are born. There are beings that have mothers and fathers, and there are beings that are born without mothers and fathers. In other words, there are spiritual beings like devas and pretas and whatever. And there are
Gandharvas.
And there are, Gandharvas, and there are contemplatives who, practicing rightly, proclaim this world and the next world, as in that they're an afterlife, after having directly known it for themselves. That is the kind of right view that a non-noble one can still have. So not only believing in karma and rebirth and in spiritual beings, but believing that there exist some people who have directly seen it is included in, by the Buddha, in mundane right view, which is, he explains, the forerunner of the other limbs of the path. So maybe there is a sort of confidence, like you're saying, that agnosticism doesn't establish you in that can act as a forerunner for the other limbs, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, because the thing is, I think the problem with the as if is that like, so it's like, there's almost like a utilitarianism in it, where it's like, okay, as if, I can believe it as if it's true because it brings me benefit, but then it's like, what is that benefit? And it's like, you're presuming the mechanisms of karma as if it would happen. But I think my experience is that like, you kind of work with karma as it happens. And that's not an as if mentality. That's like a stuff is happening to you mentality. And you're supposed to reflect and act on that. And so,
like if we take, for example, like Lojong texts that deal with karma, like the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, each verse of the Wheel of Sharp Weapons being like, this bad stuff that's happening to me right now, it is because of these bad things that I did in past lives. From now on, I will take this suffering onto myself and I will give up these bad actions. What are those verses? What is the practice of Lojong, of that type of Lojong, if you don't actually believe it?
right.
As if that, I don't.
No, exactly. And I mean, that's my general issue, like I said, with agnosticism, is like, it makes the right move, but then it unfortunately loses, I think, what's actually really important in the end of the day. And I guess this is just something I picked up from like from Dzogchen so far, is and it might not be like an overarchingly important thing, but for me it's been incredibly important, is to find that inner confidence, and being able to work with that. And that might not even be fully loaded with conceptual sophisticated understanding, but as long as you sort of are confident in your understanding of how the mind is, then you should be okay. So for me, it's less about what's true and more about how confident you are in terms of how you're going, where you're going.
I don't know. I don't want to make claims about Rajarja. He is like an extensive Mahamudra practitioner.
Sure, yeah.
Has been practiced for many years. I don't, I wouldn't want to, but even by accident, disparage someone who could be a noble one.
True. Yeah.
And also, I didn't mean to say that agnosticism being disparaging. I think that kind of agnosticism is. I get what you're saying, but I also think it's fine to be agnostic. I guess.
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, I think arguably it might be better than being a extremist fundamentalist of like either like opposition.
Maybe, yeah.
But also, there's also another thing I just want to mention too, is like, I definitely think that the level of these concepts that we're researching, it might be lifetimes until they become practically super important. I think right now I'm like very far behind in terms of practice, but of course this is why I'm getting ready and stuff. I mean, sure, it still does help me now. I don't know what I'm saying. I guess what I'm saying is that like, I don't know. It's like there could be beings who are much more excelled than us, but in a weird way, like not finding fault in them, but we can also see how we can push them as a way of pushing us, even if we're not where they are yet. But at the same time, also, I was only making general comments about agnosticism. I'm sure the person you're referring to has more nuanced views than what I mentioned. But even though my point still holds, I don't understand the whole as if like mentality, which is something like I think I've seen a lot of secular Buddhists who understand the problems with the secularization of the Dharma, but yet still want to remain in that milieu. So they'll start to do like, okay, I don't really believe in rebirth, but like an as if thing. And that's like, okay, like I guess at least you're not completely brought the secular Buddhism Kool-Aid. So okay, let's see. Says, okay, 11, 12. Hence the sage's intention to teach the Dharma was turned back, considering the difficulty for the slow of penetrating this Dharma. So I definitely want to keep going through the verses quickly so that we're not here for too long, but I do wanted to just bring up a quick topic here that I've been thinking about for a while, is this idea of the Buddha's hesitation. Now, how can a Buddha hesitate? Can you explain that to me? Or is this just a way that we're just describing?
One of the recensions of the story doesn't have the hesitation part.
Oh, okay.
It just goes straight to like the Buddha finishing like sitting under the tree for 7 weeks, and then it goes straight to the part where he uses the divine eye to look to decide who to teach first. It just skips the part. And I mean, that raises the question, is that part a deletion in that recension, or is it an addition in the other recensions? But just like, go say what you were going to say, but as a historical thing, it could be, because there is one recension where that part isn't present, that part is an addition to the story.
Just for like a quick second, if you allowed me to reify the Dharma, it's almost like the Dharma is like, well, you're trying to figure this out here a counterexample to the possibility that the Buddha was hesitant. So now figure it out. And now my thing is like, okay, like maybe it doesn't matter if the Buddha was actually hesitant or not. And it's like, if we think about the idea of the Buddha as a mere hypostatization or a display in the mind, then at least maybe appearing to hesitate, I think at least maybe is a sign for us to be contemplative and thoroughgoing about our understanding of something before we conduct our actions. And I think
about the profundity of the Dharma, that it might be so profound and so difficult to grasp that, you know.
Right, yeah, and just all of that just to display it so that it creates an impression in us of, the profundity of the Dharma, the fact that the Buddha is so excelled, but even he is contemplative and thoughtful and deliberates before he makes a radical decision. And I think this is important, even if you understand a Buddha to be fundamentally without effort and spontaneous. I guess at the very least, in order for you to not get tricked into the idea that a Buddha just like, is aloof and like whatever, which might be, so the idea that Buddha is aloof and has no like genuine responsiveness to the world might be more of damaging than the idea that a Buddha actually hesitates. Who knows, just me just thinking out loud now, but yeah, so maybe that's what we can take from here, is that whether or not he was actually from his own side hesitating, what really matters is the very teaching and his conduct that we can learn from.
Yeah, in Lalita Vistara Sutra, there's this part where the first hesitation, Lalita Vistara Sutra seems to indicate that it was actually just a true hesitation, or well, it's maybe a little bit unclear maybe, but actually what he says basically is, the Buddha says with my infinite compassion for the whole world, I do not hesitate when others supplicate me. These beings all have faith in Brahma, thus when he supplicates, I'll turn the wheel of dharma. So the hesitation, and then later it says, in order to show kindness to the world of gods, humans, and non-humans, in order to engender respect for the dharma in the world, in order to increase the root of virtue of Brahma, I think is the implied part, by having Brahma repeatedly request the dharma, and because the dharma is exceedingly profound, the Buddha went into solitude and had thought of hesitation.
They planned all this shit out and behind the scenes.
That is what the Lalita Vistra seems to be saying.
Yeah, that's funny. No, so obviously, definitely, Buddhists have been pondering this for a long time.
Yeah.
The very same concern too. That's funny.
Lalita Vistra has a lot of funny moments because Lalita Vistra is the Mahayana Sutra on the Buddha's life story. So it basically has to like give the Mahayana explanation for these like things that you might think of as anachronistic with a Mahayana view of the Buddha. So it's like, yeah, it was to help Brahma actually that he pretended to be hesitant. And stuff. It's pretty funny. It's a funny scene. I like it a lot.
So you're telling me this baby was fully conscious and aware and enlightened since the very beginning.
Cool. Lalita is also a fun word.
It has lila in it. It's like play, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I thought I was gonna say something else, but anyway. But yeah, so we can continue. 13. Moreover, the objection that you make concerning emptiness cannot be a faulty consequence for us or for emptiness. So the opponent mistakes what emptiness means, so their objections based on that misunderstanding does not apply, of course. All right, so here is, I can't tell which one's my most favorite verse. 14 of this chapter, or the first verse of the first chapter. Let's see. So I'll read it. Oh, Sagar is probably just this video.
I'm here. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No. I thought you were there. Okay. 14. All is possible when emptiness is possible. Nothing is possible when emptiness is possible. So I'll just read from the commentary because I think it's pretty succinct. By all is here meant the central teachings of Buddhism, which the opponent claimed the Madhyamaka doctrine of emptiness jeopardized. Chandrakirti explains that when, for instance, it is acknowledged that everything is devoid of intrinsic nature, then dependent origination becomes possible, and this in turn makes it possible for the Buddha's account of the origin and cessation of suffering to be correct. To deny that all things are empty, on the other hand, is tantamount to claiming that there exist things that are not dependently originated, and this undermines Buddhism's core tenets. So the commentary here sort of contextualizes this verse, particularly about the Buddhist teachings and whether or not empty and the role of emptiness in the Buddhist teachings. But I also like the more general, much more generalizable interpretation of this verse, which is that all things that we might rely upon as things to mediate our everyday activities, both mundane and dharmic, that all of that is possible only when emptiness and the dependent origination of all things is possible. And by possible, I think here, it's not only just saying possible, I think practically, but like kind of like reality too. It's like if emptiness was not true, then even experience itself would not afford us all of these qualities. And at the same time, our recognition of emptiness is what affords us the possibility of actually going on the path to awakening. Nothing is possible when emptiness is impossible. So in another way, we can say nothing is possible when svabhava is possible. And I think part of this is also what I've mentioned in previous sessions, is that the problem with svabhava is that not only does svabhava corrupt the particular entity which may be founded on a certain intrinsic quality or nature, but the very quality of intrinsic nature kind of corrupts everything that object is in contact with. And that makes sense, because if a dependently originated conditioned thing is intimately entangled and inseparable from all the things that it's dependent upon, and all the things that which depend upon it, or actually mostly just everything is dependent on, because all of this relationship, all of these relations of dependence are sort of seamless. The moment that one part of the network is separated out as something independently existent, then everything else which is related to it sort of starts to collapse, because it's sort of you've taken out an important chain of the whole link, which ironically is exactly what we do to reverse the 12 nidanas.
I wonder if there's an argument to be made here then on this basis to like build a Madhyamika critique of those strains of other religions that believe in a kind of illusionism, but then think that it's an illusion appearing because of our failure to realize some one thing that's actually real. So for example, like illusionist interpretations of the Upanishads, like we see in like Sri Harsha or Shankaracharya, where they're like, the world is illusory except for one thing, which is actually not illusory, which for Sri Harsha, for example, which is your, like as in the person reading this is, your reflexively aware mind. Everything else is illusory, but that one thing is real. And if maybe you could, because of this way, like where when you pull one thing in and insist that it's real, you end up reifying the whole thing anyway. And so in a way, only a thoroughgoing illusionism is actually able to be coherent.
Right. Yeah. All things are illusory.
I do like Sri Harsha. I have of Upanishadic philosophers, Sri Harsha has a soft spot for him.
Interesting.
And he had a soft spot for Buddhists. He kind of thought they were cool. He writes about them with some like level of interest, and not just like polemically being like, these stupid Buddhists or whatever, like a lot of, like was common in that era of polemical work.
I find that sort of Advaitin type people are very interested in Madhyamaka, and according to Malcolm, if I remember correctly, or maybe it was just like a discussion he was involved in on the forum, was how much Advaitins end up borrowing a lot of Madhyamaka terminology.
Yeah. Well, specifically, it was Gaudapada, the Advaitin, who borrowed a lot from Advaita, and then he inspired Shankara, but Shankara was very anti-Advaita. Shankara was very anti-Madhyamaka. And then Sri Harsha comes a few centuries after Shankara and is like more hard to discern exactly what Sri Harsha's relationship is to Buddhism. But
are you familiar with Swami Sarvapriyananda? I think head of the Vedanta Society of New York. But he does a lot of YouTube videos with his channel, and I think he actually thinks that there's no real contradiction between Advaita Vedanta and Madhyamaka, and claims, and apparently he has like study groups with his students, and they actually read people like Tsongkhapa and Tibetan Madhyamaka. But I feel like for him to say something like what he said, I think it's one of those cases where you're reading into what you're reading to find out what you already want to prove. Just random joke with the person with the who is this? Who is the person you said you were sympathetic to? The
Sri Harsha.
Sri Harsha, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like
to be distinguished from the king Harsha, who was visited by Xuanzang. Different person.
So his view is basically everything is illusory except one thing, and that's the girl reading this right now. Basically.
Yeah, basically.
Okay, wait. Oh, I did actually write some things. Oh, so here's the interesting point I got from verse 14 as well. All is possible when emptiness is possible. Nothing is possible when emptiness is impossible. So we can understand, right, the two truths, ultimate and conventional, as basically correlating to emptiness independent origination. That's the content of the two truths, basically. But what's interesting is that throughout, throughout the British tradition, we have this idea that the two truths are a unity, that they're not actually absolute, or at least in Madhyamika. In Madhyamika, the two truths are understood to be indivisible, united, or even one to some extent. So in a sense, emptiness and dependent origination both get equal precedence in terms of the relationship they both have to Buddhahood, right? So Buddhahood it's a perfect unity of the two. Perhaps at the level of absolute bodhicitta, emptiness and appearance are united in Buddhahood. But what's interesting is that even though we have this sort of great equality, you can say, of between the emptiness and dependent origination or appearance, conventional truth and ultimate truth, from the Buddhist so emptiness still gets precedence, but it gets soteriological precedence. It doesn't get epistemic or ontological precedence, because neither term actually gets ontological or epistemic precedence, because that would mean to sneak in ultimate truth in Svabhava. However, soteriologically and practically, emptiness does get a precedence. And I think this is because the problem is not with emptiness, the problem is with our misapprehension of appearance. And that's because of our misrecognition of the nature of emptiness. So because we start off from one extreme, taking appearances too strongly, we cultivate the opposite, so-called opposite extreme of emptiness in order to eliminate this tendency of seeing appearances to be consisting of inherently existing objects, but only in the service to come back to a point in which emptiness and appearance are indivisibly united and the experience of gnosis, right? And this is what makes me think about how, in a way, Buddhism is like a non-duality of non-duality too. It's like in the sense that there is a non-duality of emptiness and appearance, but it's not a strict ultimate non-duality, because there's still a significant and indispensable role that one side of the duality plays in the very process of realizing their non-duality. Which is distinct from, let's say, Advaita non-duality, which starts from non-duality from the very beginning, like a ontological non-duality from the very beginning.
In a way, you need, while rejecting the real existence of the dichotomy, you're relying on the concept of the dichotomy.
Definitely.
Because the concept of the dichotomy is still useful, even in reaching the point where you're able to actually dispense with the dichotomy.
Right, exactly. Let's see. Okay, that was 14, 15.
By the way, we are running a little bit over, and I know I feel bad because I feel like I went on a lot of the tangent pulling that has caused this to go a little slower, and also I'm the reason we started late as well. But I do think that I may have to go quite soon.
Sure. I mean, I'll try to speed up a little bit, because by 21, which we're close to, it does just get repetitive. But at any point, you should feel free to leave, and I'll just finish up. So just go quickly through it. 15, you throwing your own faults on us are like the person mounted on a horse who forgets the horse. Not quite the same, similar, but I think it's not quite exactly the same, but I think a similar thing is like when you're looking for your glasses, but it's like right on your head. It's like a false idea of what the actual problem. It's like a problematic view of what the even problem is. And I think in this case also, it's like a classic case of projection. The opponent is just projecting on us faults which are of their own nature. And so and so I see how it's, even at this incredibly high abstract level of like theoretical, like, contention, at the very base level is still just this really primitive psychological problem of like projecting faults you see in someone else that's actually your own. And this parallels what I've heard a lot of Dharma teachers point out is that not only is it easier to see faults in other people, sometimes it's easier to see faults in other people that are literally your own faults. And I have definitely been guilty of that. And so it's very humbling and enlightening to actually notice your own projections when they're happening. 16, if you look upon existence as real intrinsically, in that case, you regard existence as being without cause and condition. Affect in 17, affect and cause, as well as agent, instrument, and act, arising, ceasing, and fruit, all these you thereby deny. So 16 and 17 basically just points to how anything understood as being real intrinsically undermines basic aspects of causal, all the basic aspects of all the basic relations presupposed by like causality and actually getting things done. And 18 is another great one of these great verses. Dependent origination we declare to be emptiness. Emptiness, is a dependent concept. Just that is the middle path. And that, I think, parallels like what I was saying about sort of the non-duality of non-duality, in the sense that the middle is the middle is like not even just going beyond. Actually, what am I saying? Let's see. It's like the reason why we're a middle, even though we're choosing one side of the dichotomy, is because we use it provisionally and practically for its effectiveness, but then we abandoned it once its effectiveness has been exhausted. And so this is why emptiness is also empty, because it's merely imputed upon the phenomena which gets qualified as empty. So emptiness isn't something that exists by itself. It's always based on, it's always a result of analyzing a particular phenomena. So in a way, I think this parallels a lot of what I think I see Westerhoff doing, which is this sort of translation of Madhyamaka insight into the Western philosophical field as a form of like tactical nihilism. Not true nihilism, but a tactical form that undercuts what Westerhoff considers to be the prevailing realist framework of like most continental and analytic philosophy. And it's interesting because continental philosophy for a long time, since Kant, and particularly because of like the tradition of like Heidegger through Derrida, has been very much, if not anti-realist, sort of suspicious of like realism. But since the early 2000s with the speculative realist movement, that this realist movement is definitely gaining precedence in continental philosophy too. So the time is ripe for Madhyamaka tactical nihilism.
So actually, Westerhoff at one point like references Baudrillard's distinction between like 4 ways of thinking about representation, where you can have a faithful representation, an unfaithful representation, a representation where a representation where you think it's representing something, but there actually is no such thing that it's representing, and a representation where you don't even think there's something it's really representing. The last one is simulation. And Westerhoff said this is a useful way of thinking about things, but then also kind of snidely, like not snidely, but like they kind of like humorously remarks that a separate issue though is Baudrillard's claim that the fourth is the worst of these.
Oh, right,
the first is the best. And that in fact, we used to be historically in the position of the first, and now we've declined to the position of the last, kind of implying, in a weird way, the Madhyamaka wants us to be in the position of the last, experiencing everything as simulation, and saying that's the best, in fact. Because that's where you just see the appearances and you don't even think there's something behind them.
No, definitely. I've noticed this tendency. There's a way in which I think a lot of post-Marxist leftists actually get nihilistic, but not in the good kind of Madhyamaka nihilistic. And it's like a lot of the same, very similar.
Viewing it as like a decline from some pre-nihilistic.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think part of it is because there's the Svabhavic assumption has not even been touched by non-Buddhists. So they have this sense in which they're tending towards, just out of the sheer nature of the development of history and our human progress in sort of dealing with our ignorance and the consequences of it, we're sort of reaching a point where we can't help but awaken to the fact that everything is simulation-like. But for them, because they get to this truth out of sheer progress of reason and history, but because they still have that assumption that things should be some other way, in a non-illusory way, they get nihilistic, because it's not the sort of nihilist, it's not the sort of technical nihilism that Madhyamaka is utilized, because we see things as simulation-like, but we don't expect it to be anything else. And I think that expectation of something to be something else is precisely where that divergence happens, I think. Let's see, so that was 18. Okay, well, actually, I think from here on out, anyone listening, they should definitely, if not have already read all the other verses that we're not going to read, only because it basically goes through all of the lists of everything that's been already listed in the first part of the verses, and which the opponent said that we undermined from a view of emptiness. And now we're rehabilitating everything by saying that our emptiness actually makes it possible, and that actually it's the non-emptiness of the opponent's view that actually undermines the things that they say that we're undermining. And I'm pretty sure it just keeps going on from there. But I will read the last verse just to be, just wrap it up. 40. So this is, I think this is the most verses in any chapter in this text. Verse 40, he who sees dependent origination sees this, suffering, arising, cessation, and the path, which are very much, I think, relates to the quote by the Buddha, I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and the end of suffering. Yeah, and it's only because of dependent origination that the very possibility of suffering, arising, cessation, and the path to cessation is possible. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the whole chapter. It's a very fun chapter. Some two or three really great important quotes, verses here. Kind of catches you off guard a little bit too, because it's like analysis of the Four Noble Truths, but it really ends up being a very thoroughgoing defense of emptiness and all like sorts of activities, whether mundane or Buddhist. So the next chapter is analysis of nirvana. And so, yeah, so we can do that for next week. And then we'll have an analysis of the 12-fold chain or the 12 nidanas, and then analysis of views. Cool. Well, glad that we finished before you had to leave. And thank you guys for showing up this week, and I hope to see you next week.
Yep, next week, analysis of nirvana, which is a great one.
All right, bye.
Bye.